In May and June 2025, something strange happened across the US-Canada border. Canadians stopped coming. Border crossings by car from Canada into the US dropped by as much as 38%, with regions like upstate New York and Maine hit hardest. Restaurants closed early, hotels emptied, bookings vanished. Senator Chuck Schumer called it a silent economic collapse. Behind the numbers was a message: Canadians were boycotting America. The reason? Mounting resentment over tariffs, invasive border policies, and growing nationalist rhetoric out of Washington. This wasn't a headline-grabbing policy shift. It was a quiet refusal from a neighbor long taken for granted. But when your closest ally stops showing up, what happens next? For decades, Canada wasn't just America's neighbor. It was its most reliable visitor. Each year, over 14 million Canadians crossed the border, spending generously in US towns and cities. Whether it was snowbirds flocking to Florida, the Beck families hiking in Vermont, or day trippers from Ontario flooding Detroit casinos, the economic ties were deeply human. By 2024, Canadian visitors accounted for over 75% of all international travel to the US, contributing more than $20.5 billion to the American economy. Entire industries, from border town diners to national parks, quietly depended on this flow. In places like Maine, Michigan, and New York, it wasn't just tourism, it was survival. The relationship was seamless, habitual, and taken for granted. But in early 2025, something shifted. Canadian media began picking up stories of increased US border scrutiny, with reports of travelers being interrogated about political views, social media posts, and past protest activity. At the same time, Ottawa's public frustration over new US tariffs on Canadian goods began to harden into something deeper. In February, a national survey found that 62% of Canadians were reconsidering or canceling trips to the US, and nearly half of Quebec residents said they had already done so. The rise of the Buy Canadian movement, once an economic slogan, became a cultural stance. By spring, border crossings had plunged by over a third in some states. Flights were canceled, bookings dried up. Americans barely noticed, until the numbers came in. What once felt like an unbreakable bond had started to fray, not through official sanctions or fiery speeches, but through quiet acts of rejection from a population that had once voted with its passport. The US action, tariffs, tone, and the tourist drain. For decades, the United States barely had to ask for Canadian visitors. They came in droves. But in 2025, Washington issued a signal that changed everything. It began with a decision rooted not in travel, but in trade. In January 2025, the White House doubled down on its America First Again doctrine, reviving aggressive tariffs against Canadian goods. Under new executive orders, cross-border products like aluminum, steel, and lumber face sweeping 35 to 50% import taxes. The administration defended it as a move to protect US industry from unfair reliance. But north of the border, it landed like a slap in the face. To make matters worse, the Department of Homeland Security quietly implemented enhanced screening protocols at land crossings and airports. These included controversial new checks of travelers' online activity, recent political posts, and even protest affiliations. Though intended as counterterrorism filters, Canadian press painted them as ideological filters. Stories surfaced of travelers being turned away for sharing pro-environmental or anti-tariff views on Twitter. By spring, the tone in Washington had hardened. US officials dismissed early Canadian concerns as overreactions. One presidential advisor stated, "If Canada wants to play victim, let them. We're looking out for ourselves." That quote made front-page news in Toronto. The result wasn't immediate, but it was powerful. Canada didn't respond with policy. It responded with people. Border towns in Maine and New York saw the first signs. In May, car crossings from Canada dropped 38%, with 376,000 fewer visits to upstate New York alone. Maine recorded a 27.5% decline, hitting towns like Calais and Houlton especially hard. Restaurants shortened hours. Hotels posted vacancies for the first time in years during peak season. Airports felt it next. A 70% drop in Canadian spring bookings caused airlines to slash 320,000 seats on US-bound routes. Florida, once a haven for Canadian snowbirds, projected a $2.1 billion tourism shortfall. Entire resort communities, once filled with Quebec license plates, now sat nearly empty. Even Schumer, usually aligned with Washington's economic messaging, warned of serious blowback. We cannot treat allies like adversaries and expect them to keep spending money here. But the damage was already spreading. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, the U.S. risked losing up to $12.5 billion in tourism revenue and 140,000 seasonal jobs, many of which were reliant on Canadian travel by land and air. The administration remained unmoved. They believed the pain was short-term and necessary. In their words, Canadians will be back. They always come back. This time, they didn't. Canada's response, the quiet rebellion. Canada never announced a boycott, but it didn't need to. From Vancouver to Halifax, a silent wave began forming. At first it was subtle. Cancelled trips, fewer travel ads, hesitations. Then it became intentional. Canadians across social media started sharing posts tagged number not this year, highlighting why they were skipping the US in 2025. A movement that started as frustration turned into action. It wasn't just about politics, it was about dignity. "I'm not paying to be treated like a threat," read one viral tweet. "This year, I'll spend my money where I feel welcome." The statistics proved it wasn't just bluster. In Quebec, where resentment toward American policy ran deepest, 45% of residents canceled U.S. travel plans by March. Retail chains in Alberta and Ontario reported a sharp uptick in Buy Canadian purchases, particularly in categories like groceries, furniture, and electronics. Large format banners reading "Spend it here" went up in malls and highways. Travel agencies redirected customers toward Europe, the Caribbean, and domestic destinations. The impact rippled through industries that never imagined Canada's absence would matter so much. Vermont, which once relied heavily on Quebec tourists, reported a 30% drop in summer lodging reservations and outdoor activity revenue. Arizona's winter resort towns, popular among Canadians with second homes or RV parks, began recording vacancy rates not seen since the pandemic. Michigan, long interdependent with Ontario, took a hit in border towns like Port Huron and Sault Ste. Marie. Casinos, shopping outlets, and hotels experienced a 30% decline in revenue, tied directly to the loss of Windsor traffic. And it wasn't just tourism. Canadian importers began sourcing alternatives to U.S. suppliers. Where once a Quebec grocer bought oranges from Florida, now it was Mexico or Spain. Some small to medium businesses quietly rewrote procurement policies to exclude U.S. vendors, not as a protest, but as a precaution. Ottawa didn't endorse the boycott, but it didn't stop it either. Officials leaned on global relationships, finalizing a preferential tourism exchange with the EU. Marketing campaigns in France, Germany, and Japan emphasized Canada's welcoming image, contrasting it with rising nationalist sentiment abroad. Airlines rerouted seasonal flights that once went to Tampa or Phoenix toward Lisbon and Tokyo. The cultural shift deepened. Late-night shows mocked U.S. border policies. Canadian celebrities canceled appearances in the U.S. without making political statements, just absent from events they once headlined. This was not an embargo. This was consumer rebellion, personal, moral, and quietly devastating. For years, Canadians had been America's most loyal guests. Now they were gone, and they weren't angry. They were disappointed. The stalemate, a cold border in the heat of summer. By July 2025, the US-Canada border was still open, but colder than ever. There were no trade bans, no diplomatic expulsions, no fiery speeches from podiums, just empty hotel rooms, slower checkout lines, and once thriving towns now quietly adjusting to a new normal. Washington downplayed the impact. "Canada needs us more than we need them," one spokesperson said. But the data disagreed, and the local businesses living that reality had already stopped waiting for Washington to notice. Meanwhile, Canada wasn't celebrating. The absence of cross-border ties was palpable. Families canceled reunions. Sports tournaments lost their international luster. Decades of casual connection had been paused, not by force, but by fatigue. Negotiations were rumored, but trust had eroded. A neighbor ignored too long had now learned how to look elsewhere and spend elsewhere. The U.S. once viewed the northern border as stable, unshakable, inevitable. But what happens when your most reliable visitor stops knocking? Impact on Canada, empty resorts, echoes of disappointment. In Naples, Florida, hundreds of Canadian-owned properties sit under the subtropical sun, mostly vacant. For decades, this Gulf Coast town thrived during the winter months, as tens of thousands of Quebec and Ontario residents escaped the cold. Restaurants offered French menus, pharmacies stocked Canadian brands, real estate firms tailored listings to snowbirds. In 2024, Canadians made up over 3.3 million visits to Florida, contributing an estimated $600 million in tourism spending. But in 2025, the tide didn't come in. In one Canadian-owned resort community, booking rates dropped over 60%. Poolside cabanas remained shuttered. Weekly bingo nights were canceled for lack of turnout. Nearby local businesses, sandwich shops, laundromats, service staff felt the emptiness. Florida's State Tourism Board projected a $2.1 billion hit to the economy and more than 14,000 seasonal jobs lost or put at risk. Back in Canada, the disappointment was layered. Many snowbirds cited personal discomfort, not political outrage. "We just didn't feel welcome," one traveler told a CBC affiliate. "The policies changed. The tone changed. We changed our plans." Tour companies and airlines in Canada scrambled to reroute demand. More flights to Mexico, more charters to Portugal and Costa Rica. The shift created opportunities for Canadian domestic tourism, but the economic interdependence with U.S. destinations, especially in the South, had already ruptured. Even RV dealerships in Canada saw unexpected cancellations. The traditional drive south for the winter crowd was downsizing, or giving up the lifestyle entirely. Canada may not have faced a dramatic crash, but for the individuals, families, and businesses built around cross-border patterns, the break was personal and costly. Because when people stop showing up, what's lost isn't just money, it's habit. And once that's broken, it's hard to rebuild. Impact on the U.S. The collapse of Main Street economics. In Watertown, New York, just 30 miles from the Canadian border, summer used to mean traffic. Lines of Quebec license plates heading to outlet malls, diners, and campgrounds. In 2025, those cars didn't come. According to Senator Chuck Schumer, more than 376,000 fewer Canadians crossed into New York in June alone. The economic consequence was swift and brutal. Shoppers once packed into Salmon Run Mall saw their parking lot half empty. Staff at retail stores were told to expect reduced hours. Seasonal businesses in the Thousand Islands region, reliant on Canadian boaters and cottage-goers, reported revenue drops of 25% to 40% compared to the previous year. Main Street is bleeding, one shop owner told local news, and no one in Washington is paying attention. Maine fared no better. Towns like Presque Isle and Bar Harbor, deeply tied to cross-border commerce, lost more than 166,000 visitors in May and June. The estimated damage, $125 to $150 million in revenue and over 4,800 seasonal jobs on the line. Arizona and Vermont, though distant, shared the pain. Canadian retirees skipped winter stays in Tucson RV parks. Quebec hikers canceled summer trips to the Green Mountains. Vermont alone lost nearly 30% of its expected outdoor tourism income. Even beyond the border states, the effects were felt. National parks recorded lower than expected international entries. Casino revenues dipped. Gift shops near Niagara Falls closed early for the season. The US tourism sector, still recovering from the pandemic years, wasn't prepared for a boycott of this scale, especially not from its #1 international market. In interviews, Americans expressed confusion. "We didn't realize Canadians felt this strongly," one hotel manager in Buffalo admitted. "They never protested, they just stopped coming." And that's the story. No flags, no slogans, just silence. And in an economy built on movement, silence is the loudest signal of all. 2 countries, 1 border, and now 2 diverging paths. What began as a trade dispute has spiraled into a fracture of trust, habit, and human connection. The US sees short-term protection. Canada feels long-term rejection. Neither side has declared war, yet both economies bleed quietly at the edges. Hotels stay vacant, jobs vanish. Streets that once welcomed laughter in 2 languages now echo in 1. Officials in Washington wait for Canadians to return. But Canada has already moved on, redefining where it travels, buys, and believes it belongs. And as the summer of silence lingers, a continent built on cross-border cooperation is left wondering. In the race to define the future, will North America win together or fall apart trying to go it alone? You're American or Canadian? What's your take? Share your story in the comments below.